So in these sessions, we'll be discussing top of mind sales and HR related issues facing the network. This is the first session of the year, and we're discussing unlocking deals stalled due to COVID-19. I'm going to be joined throughout all of these sessions in the series by my good friend Gareth Way, who's the CHRO of the Credit Safe Group back in the UK. Gareth, why don't you say hello?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope that you find this entertaining over your lunch break. So Rich, like you said, jumping straight into it. This topic came up as a result of conversation across the Alcon Maddox network, both in the UAE and Europe. With regards to these deals stalling, what do we actually mean by that?
Okay, right, it's a good question actually to kind of set the scene. But just before I get into that, guys, if you do have any questions or comments throughout, just put them in the chat box and I'll happily read them out. It's just going to be Gareth and I on the session today. Okay, so fine, great question. So let me just frame this for you. What do we mean by stalls? By deals stalling due to COVID-19? Look, no matter what you're selling, product, service, the reality is there is a pipeline from beginning to end, right? The pipeline can be defined by stages. So, for example, first call, meeting, proposal issued, contract signed, delivery underway, or you may have it defined by activities. So, prospecting, qualifying, negotiating, signing, onboarding, as an example. Now, in a normal situation, when a deal sticks, usually it sticks at the end when we're going to close or get the contract signed. But usually at that time, we can essentially revisit our sales process and understand what is it we've missed. Maybe there is an objection that we haven't overcome sufficiently to satisfy our client, prospect rather, or there's an objection that we haven't yet uncovered. So revisiting the conversation, previous conversation, the process enables us to do that. Once you've done that, ordinarily we can then progress to close. Now, with the current situation with COVID-19, what's actually happened is there are many deals that have got to that final closing stage, but because of an external factor that not a lot of people were able to foresee, deals have stalled at signing, if you like. And what that means is there are many people's pipelines that are now perceived to be full of business that is yet to complete. The challenge is when a deal, and let's just call it a deal for argument's sake, even though they haven't yet signed it. When a deal has been in your pipeline for an extended period of time, and this can be different for any business, right? I mean, you know on the call today how long your typical deal cycle will be. But when a deal has been stalled at a particular stage for an extended period of time, how do we then get it over the line? And I've been discussing this exact challenge with a number of people within the network over the last couple of months because I've had the same challenge myself.
I was going to say, have you actually experienced this personally then, Rich?
Yeah, exactly. No, the reality is I as the owner of my business, I actually in charge of the business development arm of our organization. So yeah, this is something I faced as well. I'll give you a live example if you like. So we had a client that we were discussing a role with 9 months ago, so the director of sales position. Okay, we got right to the end where we would typically sign the contracts. So they were happy with our company, with our process, with our ability to deliver. They spoke to references. Everything was great. We understood their organization, and they wanted to hire a director of sales. COVID happens, and suddenly they put the brakes on. For a number of different reasons, but the main reason being uncertainty about the future and whether or not they should hire. Okay. Over the last 9 or so months, we've been discussing. Every time I touch base with this client, we've been discussing. When are we going to get this mandate up and running? When are we going to be able to get a contract signed and start delivering for you? And I'm sure there are many people in a similar situation, right? Irrespective of what their business is. And a conversation I had with one of the members in the network just a few weeks ago, they introduced, and again, this is not a new idea, right? This is the thing, we all know it, but perhaps sometimes we're just not brave enough to do it. He just said, look, the reality is the deal isn't ready to close. The deal needs to be regressed right to the beginning of the pipeline and essentially requalified. So what in the next engagement I have with the clients, we discussed, okay, look, I was just upfront with the client. Look, the reality is we've been discussing director of sales for the last 9 months, but the perception, I think, is that now I'm just chasing you, trying to get a deal over the line, and it has become more me chasing you for money rather than an actual relationship that we started off with. So I just said, look, let's just forget that. Put the director of sales role to one side a moment. I need to relearn your business. I need to understand what are your current top of mind challenges. How is the market affecting you? What is your vision of the future? And as the role that we've been discussing, or rather I've been discussing, actually, not them, I've been wanting to discuss with you for 9 months, is it still relevant? And it was fascinating, the conversation we then had, because what we determined was, well, the role is no longer relevant because the company is downsized somewhat. They still have a hiring need, but that, because everyone is now wearing multiple hats, they don't need a director of sales, they actually need a commercial director, because they need someone to manage sales, marketing, and product combined. So the point is, without the foresight to regress that deal and start all over, I was kidding myself that was actually a deal that was ready to close, if that makes sense. So so for me, it's been a mindset shift based on conversations that I've had within the network. And I'd be really interested to know for you, Gareth, given that you essentially run a pretty large sales organization that spans a number of different countries, is this something you've experienced, and is this a mindset that you want to promote within your organization?
Definitely. I mean, for clarification, I work in HR, so I don't run the sales element. But I think when you look at the what you've pointed out there is mindset, and that's the key thing. There are essentially two, other than the client, there are two people at play in this, and you've got the sales manager, or the person who's leading sales within the organization, and the salesperson. So I mean, when you look at it from that perspective, Rich, and obviously you've been in both positions for over a number of years, what are the challenges there with regards to adopting that mindset? I mean, personally, I'd imagine if I was a salesperson and I've got a sales manager that understands the importance of this process and regressing that sales deal to an earlier point within the sales funnel, I guess that's going to give me an element of comfort and make me feel that I've been supported by that sales manager. Is that, does that kind of?
I think this is an interesting point, because there's two pieces here. There's two people we're talking about. We're talking about salesperson, and we're talking about sales manager. So if you look at the salesperson's it's you can have a pipeline full of business that you've spent a lot of time developing, and you're obviously being managed by a sales manager from a salesperson's perspective. Now, having been in a situation where we've got a pipeline full of business, if the you kind of kid yourself, you've got 50 deals in the pipeline. As you progress the deal through the pipeline, for example, at the beginning, you allocate different portions of revenue, okay? So initially, obviously when you're at the qualifying stage, no revenue is allocated. When you get to perhaps the meeting stage, maybe a 10% chance of the deal closing. Once you send a proposal, there may be a 50% chance of a deal closing, and so on and so forth. And this is essentially used to forecast how much revenue are we going to achieve within this year. Now, the challenge comes if we're now being brutally honest with ourselves and saying, okay, all these deals that are at the end of the pipeline where we're saying there's a high chance of closing, that there's no longer a high chance of closing, we have to push them back to the front of the pipeline. What we're essentially doing is saying none of the revenue I forecast is realistic, and that's quite an undertaking, or quite you need to be very honest with yourself and your business in order to do that. So from a salesperson's perspective, I can understand why people will be nervous about doing that. From a sales manager's perspective, again, I can understand why they would be nervous about reporting upstream. Look, the reality is the revenue that we forecast is now unrealistic. So it really, but unless you do that, you are painting a false picture of what revenue you can anticipate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it sounds as though what you're saying there, you've got the kind of emotional connection to the work that's been done previously. You don't want to let that go, and you're hanging on to some kind of dream that this sale is this deal is going to land because of the work that you've done, without actually accepting that because of the stall in the deal, you've got to go back and effectively do that work all over again. So that's, I mean, from a psychology perspective, that's got to be quite tough as a salesperson, right?
Yeah, 100%. Because again, look, what you're paid for as a sales guy is the deals that close, right? You're not necessarily paid for all the work that goes in beforehand, but the reality is the work that goes in beforehand is necessary, and that can, in some businesses, those deal cycles can be 6 to 9 months long. So you have an external factor like COVID that puts that stalls that deal. You can have been talking to a prospect for 12 to 18 months to now be faced with the prospect of saying, this isn't a possible deal. We need to put this person right back to the beginning of the pipeline and start all over again. You can understand why there would be a degree of resistance to that. Resistance because they don't want to perhaps do the work again, but also resistance because it would expose them as a salesperson with zero value in their pipeline. But so they need to be brave from a salesperson's point of view, but then from a sales leadership point of view, we need to be, I believe we need to encourage that right now, because unless we're kidding ourselves if we don't do it, right? Otherwise, we're just looking at the pipeline of business. We're thinking, okay, right, that's great. We've got a number of great deals, great people in our pipeline. Deals they'll tip over soon. But the reality is, I think the other thing that's important to mention is that regarding competition. So if you've been talking to a client for 18 months and your conversation now essentially becomes irrelevant because you haven't taken the time to relearn your prospect's business, if a new company engages with this prospect and qualifies them today based on today's situation, they will be in a much stronger situation than you. They'll be having a much more relevant conversation with them. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I'm just interested, Rich. I mean, obviously, I can't see any conversation or questions coming in. What are people's thoughts with regards to this concept of the importance of regression?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, guys. Let's have some questions in the chat box, and we're happy to read them out. We've got one from Sam. So Sam says the sales fundamentals are the same, however, the dynamics of how is changing dramatically. Yeah, look, I think the reality is, I think you made a good point, Sam. The reality is, yeah, look, sales as a process is not changed, but it's not so much even how. I think it's just revisiting, right? It's being able to restart. We haven't got someone to the end of the deal cycle and we're just trying to convert them over the line. We need to go back. So I'll give you an example. If you imagine the sales funnel, let's say your sales funnel is like this. You've got the external kind of marketing, business development activity that bring people to the top of the funnel, and the sales people move people down the funnel to the point of close where they handle all the objections. And this is ultimately where your deal gets signed. Now, the reality is, the longer they stay here, they're not there at all. If you imagine another scenario, now fill this sales funnel with water and give each of your prospects a life jacket. What actually happens is the longer they stay there, they start rising back to the top of the funnel. And this is essentially what's happening with all the deals in our pipeline. We just need to recognize the longer they're there, the more likely is they've now crept up to the top of the pipeline, and some of them may just break free and they're no longer engaging with us. Maybe they stop picking up the phone, maybe they stop having worthwhile conversations with us. So we need to be able to engage with them on a level that's relevant, and that means revisiting or requalifying. What you may actually find, and I'm sure I'm going to find this in conversations I have with prospects over the next few weeks, is that a lot of the people I thought would do business with us, having requalified them, they're either no longer in a position to, or they don't qualify for services. Either way you look at it, they shouldn't be in the pipeline. So we're doing ourselves and themselves an injustice by keeping them there and having conversations that mean nothing to either party. I have a question from Tatiana. So Tatiana says, do you have any tips on how to identify the buyer's behavior on the online meetings? How to identify signals in no face-to-face meeting situations? Which is actually a really good question. I'm not going to give too much away today, Tatiana, because one of the other topics on our agenda for the Lunch and Learn sessions, which will be in March, I believe, will be selling via video conference. Because what Tatiana is asking is actually a very, very relevant question, because when you're in the same room as someone, there are lots of cues you can pick up from a body language perspective. But when you're trying to sell someone of a video conference, it's very different. You can still see people, but the cues are not the same. So we'll be going into that in more detail in a following session. Okay, so I'm not going to give too much away on that today, but that is definitely a top of mind challenge that's been faced throughout the network. Also, I think the thing to consider on that point, actually, and I learned a lot about this many years ago when I was back in the UK when I was a stockbroker. We had to sell large deals over the phone to people that we would never meet. Essentially, stockbroking is just a glorified telesales job, right? And in that, we learned a lot about neuro-linguistic programming, about hearing, not so much about what people are saying, but what's hidden within the words of what they say. And we'll bring some of these examples into that session as well, because I think they'll be extremely relevant for that conversation. Hans has a point. So Hans, would you not say it also differs per region, market, and the cultural aspect also plays a big role? Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right, Hans. I think, and this doesn't necessarily, this isn't isolated to deal stalling. I think depending on what markets you operate within, where your clients are based, there is a different level of interaction that's required. Some people, for example, in the Middle East, we do business by building a relationship with someone first, and then contract would naturally follow. Whereas in the UK, for example, you would prove yourself with numbers, figures, capabilities in that sense, sign a deal, and then a contract would follow. Then a relationship would follow. I mean, what is your experience in this, Gareth? Because I know the company that you operate in spans a number of different
international. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are different practices within different cultures, but I think what you've been talking about there with regards to pipeline management and the importance of regressing and accepting when a deal is stalled, I think is actually, it crosses all borders. The timing may be different, the approach may be slightly different, but I think that kind of, if we simplify things into, you've got your pipeline, you've got the end of that process is typically where it either gets signed or it sits there for a prolonged period because people won't accept that there's more work to be done. I think that concept of having to regress that's the same everywhere.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me about the concept of pipeline regression is if you imagine, well, a lot of you will not have to imagine you're living it at the moment. You've got deals in your pipeline, and there's regular interaction. Maybe because of the deal stalled, because of the reason the deal stalled, you diarise to check in with these guys maybe once a week, once a fortnight, once a month, once a quarter, whatever that may be. Challenge becomes, what are you discussing in each of these interactions? Because calling them and asking them, are you ready to sign now, is not the kind of conversation any salesperson or prospective client wants to get into. So every time you have a conversation, yes, it's necessary to touch back on that point. But how can you consistently make sure that every interaction you have, you're offering some value or building on that foundation relationship? the challenge is when we have so many of these interactions during this stalled period, it becomes quite hard for a salesperson to think, okay, what am I going to discuss? I've diarised to chase this client up again today. What am I going to discuss? And this is one of the problems that salespeople face, and it's why a lot of relationships fade away, because it's this nervousness, if you like. This what am I going to discuss? What am I going to ask the client today? And the conversations, what happens is the conversation with the clients gets shorter and shorter and shorter, to the point where literally they are just calling and saying, are we ready to do a deal? And that's the point when you know, if you get anywhere near that point, you know right then, this is when you need to regress that deal. Because at this particular, if your conversations have deteriorated to that extent, that is a clear indication that the deal is no longer on the table. You need to revisit and re-qualify that client. And as I said, the way I've started doing this personally is just being upfront with the prospect and saying, look, we originally were discussing this. Let's just put that to one side. Let's start again. Let me relearn your business. And when, certainly from our experience already, when we've been that open, honest, and interested in our prospects, they're a lot more interested in having continuing conversations with us. Because again, we don't want to get into a situation where you're chasing, the client sees your phone number come up on their mobile and they stop answering you. I'd be interested to know, has anybody on the call today experienced that? You've been chasing a client for so long that they actually stopped taking your calls? Mohammed has a question. Marketing should support the marketing should support to qualify opportunities for sales. How can we integrate marketing to sales? Great question. Look, marketing is in fact an integral part of sales. Gareth, sorry, I'm conscious of the fact that this is not meant to be a monologue.
No, I mean, I go with that question first, because I mean, one of the things that I was going to ask you, Rich, was you've talked about your experience and the fact that you've had to go through this regression process over the course of the last few months. And I'm just thinking of it from the point of view of some of the people on the call today are going to be sales leaders. Maybe part of the value we can add here is helping them understand the kind of fears associated in being told to regress their pipeline. So I mean, what are some of the things you've had to kind of battle with prior to having those conversations? You said you had difficult conversations with some of these potential clients where you've had to go in and be almost quite blunt with regards to the fact we're forgetting this role now. What was the kind of process you went through mentally to prepare for that?
I think, look, and again, I'm looking at this from a business owner's perspective. But again, it's the same thing if you're a sales manager leading a team, right? You're responsible for a degree of revenue for your organization, right? And if you're brutally honest with yourself and say, right, okay, there is zero realistic revenue in this pipeline. How do we start to generate more realistic revenue? That's the first kind of shift for me, as I'm sure it will be for many people. And it's a painful process to go through, because until you realize that there's either zero or limited revenue that will be coming in, you can't free your mind to think about, okay, how should I be interacting with these people within my pipeline? Because again, the reality is, if your focus now is speaking to 50 people within your pipeline on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and you haven't been brave enough to regress and revisit the initial conversations, you could be speaking to the wrong people, because there are possibly more qualified prospects out there, or more qualifiable prospects out there that you're not engaging with because you don't have time to, because you're spending time with people who you think are going to pay your bills when in actual fact they won't. So it's that. So yeah, it's painful to admit in any business that all the work we've done to date is irrelevant. And it's irrelevant not because, and again, we're not questioning the effort that anyone's put in. We're saying that it's possibly irrelevant because the market, the landscape in which we operate our businesses has changed. And until we recognise that, we cannot expect to progress. And that's been progressing the pipeline that we're currently managing, but then also the any new deals that we're looking to bring into the pipeline. So I'm just going to pick up this couple of questions here, Gareth. We've got something from Pradeep. So Pradeep says, having experienced this firsthand, where I could not get the projected revenues due to COVID delayed closures, put me in a bad light in front of my management, who were unwilling to admit or understand the situation. Yeah, and I think, look, so I've spoken about it from perhaps a salesperson's point of view, but Pradeep, you made a very good point. I think the reality is sales leaders, company owners, anyone responsible for a revenue generating department needs to understand this very important dynamic, because unless we have the foresight to start again building our pipeline, we're kidding ourselves, right? Unless we allow our salespeople to start again and help them to start again, we run the risk of overpromising ourselves, because we're saying that there's a pipeline ready to close when it's not. But also we run the risk of, because of the pressure we're exerting on our sales guys, we run the risk of losing salespeople, because one, they're not earning money, which means they may leave, but also we're putting our businesses in a position where we may need to let these people go, because from a business perspective, the perception is if a salesperson is not generating money, then they're not worth their seats. So from a sales leadership perspective, this is a very, very important mindset shift to encourage. Look, this is only meant to be a 30-minute session. We're desperately about to run out of time. So Gareth, look, so sorry, just before we close, guys, we'll make a post on LinkedIn as well, because I think this is a really important conversation to continue. So we'll make a post on LinkedIn. If you want to continue the conversation there, I'm more than happy to continue this. But Gareth, just in closing, what do you want to say as a kind of final note on this topic?
Well, I think there's been a theme that's been running through this, Rich. And I mean, ultimately, it's about being brave enough to be realistic in your assessment of your pipeline. And you know, the last comments you made there with regards to the importance of sales leadership, understanding that you can, you know, leaders can kid themselves that there's X amount in the pipeline. Commercially, that isn't a good move. And like you've highlighted, the risk you run with regards to losing good people that could potentially be saved by demonstrating that understanding is huge. So I guess that would be the kind of key takeaway from this conversation. I think it's worth mentioning as well, Rich, you've highlighted there people getting involved in the conversation. All of this has been built out of the network that you've created. So I think that anybody listening to this, if they've got other kind of top of mind challenges that they would like to kind of bring to the forefront for these lunch and learn sessions, to get in touch with you as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, actually, Gareth. Look, guys, if there's any, I know there's a couple of questions that we haven't had time to discuss, and then today, a couple of marketing related questions also. Please write more comments in the chat box. There are the questions. What I'll do is I'll collect all these after the session, and then I'll either engage with you individually, or we'll certainly get some more commentary on LinkedIn. But we'll be up sessions now running every month. The Selling by Video conference will be, we have that already scheduled for March, but there'll be others that will be posted on our website and LinkedIn in the coming weeks. So look, thanks very much, guys. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as well as your lunch, whatever that may have been, and we'll look forward to engaging with you next month. Okay, guys, see you soon.
Take care.